experiences, each of us with a specific focus on socio-political events in Eastern Europe and the arts. Despite the increasing interest in the subject, it is still something that most people have not heard about or know little about, even though it affects our whole society and humanity. So I'm hoping that the seminar shall form a starting point for further conversation and projects. So also, please feel free to get in touch with me after the seminar if you have further questions or ideas. Intergenerational trauma has been kind of haunting me throughout my life. It seems to me as if this history of my ancestors' displacement has been stuck in my own bones. It seems sometimes more natural for me to move around rather than arriving, and it feels more normal to me to feel alienated rather than feeling belonging. My own symptoms, as I like to call them, have led me to further research in psychology and neurology in the past years, and I will share a brief introduction to this research in my lecture today. As a descendant of a Polish father and German mother, I'm a hybrid by nature, a phenomenon that is less unusual nowadays in our globalized world. But as the only mixed family in the German village where I grew up, I experienced the fear of the literally moving of cultural borders, because it meant for the people that lived in this village to challenge their own identities, and also the trauma that came from this German situation. My hybridity has helped me to understand more about the sociology of fear and how homogeneous groups handle the unknown. So rather than letting these projections and prejudices sink into me, I used the time in my youth as a form of social analysis, as I like to call it. Nevertheless, obviously, this alienating situation has also caused some form of identity crisis to me. And in some ways, I believe that this forms me as an artist today, which I'm also grateful for. Changing states are kind of a fragile situation. Since this instability was the usual situation for me, I used to become more resilient. Ironically, to be defined as the other can also be turned into a privilege, in my opinion. It can open new pathways in our own way of thinking. The feeling of not fitting in with my feelings and emotions allowed me to branch out and cross borders that the Germans that were surrounding me didn't dare to cross. And eventually, this led me to work in the past years on multiple projects in collaboration with refugees, with whom I reflected upon the subjects of identity further. Consciousness is not what you are, but what you do. This is a quote from one of my favorite contemporary philosophers, who is also a neurophilosopher. His name is Alvanoe. I'm aware that my identity is largely formed by my own actions in the present, but I still can feel how these past experiences of my ancestors are reaching far into the presence of what I experience nowadays. For a long time, I could feel the symptoms of intergenerational trauma, but I could not place them into a box. Nowadays, I believe that alienation can be pleasant or used as a creative tool, but I think we should always know what it is that alienates us in order to be able to control this alienation. The other day, my mother shared with me the story of my father's search for asylum in Germany. In the 90s, my father regularly visited Bonn in Germany to visit his friends. That's where he also met my mother, as you see on this picture here. During one of his visits in 1981, the Polish People's Republic announced the martial law in Poland. In Polish, it means stan wojenny w Polsce. The country was occupied by the Soviet Union at that time. As a consequence of this martial law state, everyday life was drastically restricted in an attempt to counter political opposition, in particular the solidarity movement that my father was part of. The movement started in the harbors of Poland, where workers were facing inhumane conditions. Thousands of activists were imprisoned, and circa 100 were killed in that period. From one day to the other, my father was not able to return to his homeland or get in contact with either one of his family members. So in this picture, you can see my parents with a Polish boat captain. And this captain went at his time regularly from Poland to Germany with his boat to legally transport goods, but secretly he also transported family or love letters, such as the one that my family in Poland wrote to my father. Because also the Polish post was watched over by the government, and people were trying to find out where these people were going to that were trying to be imprisoned. So being stuck in Germany, he tried to further strengthen the Polish-German cultural exchange, specifically through folklore dance. And while these dance forms may be considered as old-fashioned nowadays, it was a form of resistance in these oppressive times. Eastern European countries have a long history of Soviet occupations that still reach into the present, as we can see on the present example of Belarus, that we probably have all heard about in the media. In this seminar, we will have other examples by looking at Ukraine and Georgia. Many Eastern European countries have moved their maps multiple times throughout the 20th century. So my roots are spread over Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, and Germany. You can imagine how difficult it is to collect the puzzle pieces in such a situation. On the picture, you can see my father's parents. So on the right-hand side, you see my grandfather, my dziadek Franciszek, who had to actually leave with his family from what is now known as Belarus. On the left, you can see my Ukrainian grandmother, my babcia Irena, who had to flee her home at an early age due to the Soviet oppression in Ukraine. They passed away many years ago, but with them also the stories that I would like to hear more about. And this is supposedly one of the main problems of intergenerational trauma. We can feel the symptoms inside of us, but we are lacking the access to the sources that will provide us for the translation of the intergenerational symptoms. On one hand, this is through the passing away from ancestors. On the other hand, also because oppressive forces have destroyed archives and other informations. But I feel that art allows us to fill these gaps of history in a way that we can translate our own symptoms into new materials. I like to think of us as artists, as scientists of the ungraspable material. So in our collaborative lecture performance that we are presenting to you later in the seminar, my collaborator, Jackie Rydz, has interviewed their grandmothers. And they were very happy that someone was actually interested to listen to them. So sharing our stories makes us visible. And with this comes also a form of resistance, something that I believe still nowadays is in most oppressive regimes, something that is trying to be diminished. In my opinion, the exchanges between generations is a first attempt to break the cycle of trauma. So that being said, I would encourage everyone in the seminar who still can to speak to their ancestors and learn more about what their history is. The subject of intergenerational trauma is multi-layered and complex. So I'm sitting in my studio right now, surrounded with piles of books, and I feel that it would require a whole series of seminars to reflect on these subjects. I first learned about the research of intergenerational trauma when I studied psychology and dance in 2012 and 13. One day I came across a study which explained that grandchildren of Holocaust survivors had reoccurring nightmares of their grandparents' experiences. The crazy situation about this is that their grandparents have never spoken to their grandchildren about these stories. So this is something that science was like getting curious about. How could these stories kind of go into these nightmares from people, even though they have never learned about them in reality, so to say? Science is still at the beginning to understand how such epigenetic transmission works. Alan Shen of the Max Planck Institute for Psychiatry here in Berlin explains that the epigenetic impact of trauma does not mean that the DNA sequence is being changed, but that the transmission of the epigenetic signature, as he calls it, is impacting proteins in our body. And this again may lead to some impact to nerve cells, which, as maybe some of you know, is leading to anxiety or other illnesses in people who have kind of inherited intergenerational trauma. On the left-hand side of this picture here, you can see an illustration of neuroscientist Santiago Ramón y Cajal. He lived from 1852 to 1934. Maybe some of you know about him. He was one of the first people who would engage with the subject of neurons, which allows us nowadays to learn about studies such as the ones that Max Planck Institute conduct. In the past years of researching one of these important subjects, I've learned that memories are not stored just in our brain, but throughout our body. That's something why I'm also enjoying so much to work with dancers. Alba Noé likes to say that dancers are like scientists. So I've primarily spoken about epigenetic transmission of trauma so far. The varied selection of speakers today is allowing us to look at the way of transmitting trauma in other ways too, such as through arts and culture. Sometimes people ask me why contemporary art is often unsettling and painful, and yes, maybe also traumatizing to look at. And I suppose it makes sense to look back at the 20th century as an age of catastrophes, as Marianne Hirsch famously says. While we are presently perceiving an increase of traumatic situations, again, with like the refugee situation and other forms of wars in the world, we still have not processed those from the past, which in my opinion leads to an increase of nationalistic perspectives in countries such as Poland. Whether within families or whole cultures and nations, the silencing of trauma leads to a repression of feelings that can lay over us like a shadow. To quote Hirsch again, the 21st century seems strangely attached to the past. But on one hand, it is a form of nostalgia for a homogenic past that has long passed. On the other hand, there are people in our pluralistic society like us who look for their roots as a form of healing. Philosopher Simone Weil said in her beautiful essay Uprootedness in 1949, to be rooted is perhaps the most important and least recognized need of the human soul. So this year's theme of Refugee Week, We Cannot Walk Alone, can also be applied to the dealing of trauma, and hence this seminar. Specifically, traumatic consequences of socio-political events are not just affecting the individual person, but entire cultures. And I would even say the entire planet, because it is not just humans and bodies that are traumatized, but whole landscapes. When a crime against humanity occurs, all of humanity is affected. As psychologist Christy Charkutian says about intergenerational transmission of trauma. I believe that to heal trauma, we must form collective actions in our pluralistic society in which we can exchange rather than compare and listen rather than just judge. I've only looked at surfaces of my research in this lecture right now, but I can already announce that there will be further projects planned for the end of this year and next year. So now I would like to pass the microphone on to the next speaker, Olesya Khromeychuk, who will travel with us to Ukraine and the wonderful and also very emotional world of theater. So Olesya Khromeychuk is a historian of 20th century East Central Europe. She has a PhD in history from University College London. She also runs a theatre company, Molodich Theatre London, I hope I pronounced it correctly, that stages documentary pieces exploring urgent social and political themes. She's also the author of Undetermined Ukrainians, post-war narratives of the Waffen-SS Galicia division, and A Loss, the story of a dead soldier told by his sister.
Monika, thank you very much for that introduction. And thank you so much for inviting me to this seminar. It's such a pleasure to be part of it. I'm really looking forward to all the other presentations. I'm sure they'll provide an awful lot of food for thought. So in my brief talk today, I'd like to consider the Ukrainian context of transgenerational trauma, or the way I try to understand it. The territory that comprises contemporary Ukraine has seen a lot of traumas in the 20th century. That's the period that I mostly focus on in my work. I hesitate to list them all. As you can imagine, the destruction of the First World War, the subsequent collapse of the empires, the frequent pogroms that followed, but then also followed by brutal civil wars, competing state-building projects, and failure to secure statehood for Ukrainians themselves, and then a very violent formation of the USSR. Ukraine suffered particularly badly from Stalin's collectivization, lost several million in the famine in the 1930s, known in Ukrainian as Holodomor. And that the Holodomor is really one of the major traumas for Ukrainians as a nation. The famine was then followed by the purges by the Second World War, which truly turned that territory, including, and also not just Ukraine, of course, but also Belarus and parts of Poland, into what Timothy Snyder called bloodlands. Yeah, the Holocaust destroyed most of the sizable Jewish community that resided in this part of the world. Ukrainians fought both with and against the Red Army, and so lives were lost at absolutely, enormous numbers. And even after the Second World War finished, the continued attempts to resist the consolidation of the Soviet regime continued to claim a lot of lives. So that's really turbulent beginning of the first half of the 20th century. But the collapse of the USSR itself was a major trauma for much of the population, especially the economic hardship and the mass immigration that it brought with it. And now Ukrainians are going through another major trauma. Russian aggression in the Donbass region that caused the war that's been going on for over 7 years. Now, even according to official statistics, more than 14,000 lives have been lost in this war. A lot of them are those of civilians. And a huge chunk of the population of Eastern Ukraine has been turned into internally displaced persons. And these new wounds are layered on top of the old ones. And some of the old traumas and memories, they fuel the current war. And I would be happy to talk about it in the Q&A session. And in turn, of course, the ongoing war will have to be dealt with by generations to come. And I do believe that theater could potentially help us make sense of some of these traumas. I'm going to share my screen now and use some images to talk about the 3 plays that I'd like to discuss in my talk today. So I want to briefly discuss 3 documentary plays. Bad Roads, Погані дороги by Natalia Borozhbyt, Product, Tovar by Alex Sardaryan, and All That Remains, a show that I wrote myself and staged with Melody Theatre London. And these are the 3 sort of questions I'd like to consider today. How the use of documents, because these are mostly documentary pieces, how the use of documents in these pieces contributes to the perception of watching theatre in the making, right? Not theatre, watching history in the making through theatre. Whether the fragmented nature of documentary evidence that is used in these pieces precludes the creation of a coherent narrative of war. We like simple stories about wars. We like good and evil, right? There's a temptation to make things simple. These shows don't. And how the act of witnessing the retelling of traumatic events on stage turns the audience into second-hand witnesses, or maybe post-witnesses, of the trauma experienced by the narrators. Okay, these 3 plays are really quite different, but I mean they're similar in the fact that they are of documentary nature, but they're also similar in the sense that they've not been funded by the state, the Ukrainian state, or any other such institution. So they are free to, from the expectation, perhaps, if not obligation, to portray a particular type of narrative that is often quite heroic or lacks self-reflection. They choose very different routes. They're free to do so. And they also speak of war through voices that civilian audiences can relate to. So Bad Roads is narrated mostly by civilian voices. Its opening scene, you can see an image here from the opening scene, is based on the playwright's own experience of researching for another project that she was working on at the time. So she was writing a script for a film about the battle for Donetsk airport, the film called Cyborgs, a very different piece of product a very different product to Bad Roads. So she is documenting not only the war itself, but she's documenting her journey as a civilian of learning about war. The product is narrated not by a civilian, it's narrated by a paramedic who's an active participant in the conflict. But similarly to Vorozhbyt, Alex Sardaryan, who wrote and performs, narrates this piece, is kind of an outsider both to the region but also to the war itself. He calls himself a pacifist who volunteered to join the front line as a paramedic. So it's his autobiographical monologue that describes his service at the front line during some of the most heated parts of the conflict, including, some of you might be familiar with this, the Battle of Debaltsevo. And all that remains is narrated mostly by me or the actors that retell my experiences, and partly by my brother, as I play 3 videos on stage that he recorded at the front line. You can see a still from one of those videos on the image there. Now, one of the videos he took the day before he was killed while on duty at the front line, and I still don't know why he made those videos. It doesn't seem like he's sent them to anybody. I found them in his phone when I received the phone together with his other belongings. So all 3 of these pieces that I talk about today rely on primary evidence for the crafting of their stories, and as such are largely documentary pieces. And here's a definition of documentary theatre that Molly Flynn provides. She describes it as a wide range of reality-based performance pieces. It can be broadly understood as an umbrella term that includes any theatrical performance that draws on real-life events and incorporates documentary materials. Documents are very important here. Now, Carol Martin writes that documentary theatre tends to re-emerge during periods of international crises, including wars, right? And she argues that this type of theatre is often made in order to set the record straight. We can talk about that, but also to bring materials otherwise ignored to the public's attention. So the primary documents that serve as the basis for all these 3 plays are trying to help the audiences access the reality of political violence and perhaps make it a bit more comprehensible, even if themselves these documents are highly fragmented and they maybe leave more gaps than they fill. Now, this fragmented nature of the plays that I'm discussing, in my view, is actually not necessarily disadvantageous to the pieces or to the narratives that they construct. The war is ongoing. Our understanding of this war is still very fragmented. And so the use of this fragmented primary material in these performance pieces does create a feeling of watching history in the making. At least that's my understanding of it. And so it sort of adds to our perception as audiences of accessing the real thing, right? So these shows transform the viewers and characters of the stories told into a symbolic we. Yeah, or to put it in Susan Sontag's words, this we would include not just the sympathizers of a smallish nation or a stateless people fighting for its life, but a far larger constituency, those only nominally concerned about some nasty war taking place in another country. Susan Sontag talks about photographs, but I think it's really relevant to the documents that are being used in this documentary theatre. When asked why he decided to share his own testimony on stage, Alex Sardaryan said the following. He said, "I don't want people who aren't involved in the war and haven't seen it with their own eyes to think that it's like the Lord of the Rings. There are orcs and there are elves and they fight one another. War is still blood, dirt, sweat, and pain. Even if you're safe, it's still very scary. I would like people to feel it through the play." And in his publicity material, he addresses his potential audience using very unambiguous language. He says, "Are you tired of depressing news stories? You don't want to hear or talk more about the war? You want to be distracted by something lighter? Well, then you can fuck off to another theater," right? So he sets very clear expectations of his audiences. Natalia Vorozhbyt in Bad Roads too is highly conscious of the audience's presence during the show. Her narrator shares her experience of learning about the war intimately through her affair with a soldier, as if it was some kind of secret. And this is what the narrator says. She says, "I don't know what you'd do if you found out I was telling an audience in the theater about us. Would you shoot me dead? No, of course not. But I know you'd be angry and you'd break off all relations with me straight away." So this part of the monologue creates the feeling that the audience has witnessed something it wasn't supposed to witness. We caught a glimpse of the real life at the front line with its blood, dirt, sweat, and pain that Alex Sardayan really wants to highlight, but also with a space for intimacy. And in All That Remains, I address the audience directly all the time. And for those monologues, we even put the house lights on to kind of acknowledge the audience's presence there among us. And we also use a variety of documents that I found with my brother's belongings that we pass around so the audience can actually touch them. So, you know, we create this kind of physical contact with some of the pieces of theater, essentially. So by using first-hand witness testimonies and presenting artifacts from the war zone in front of the audience, these pieces of theater that I'm talking about make the war zone a bit more familiar and comprehensible, and for that reason, harder to ignore. The act of witnessing is crucial for this type of theater, and according to Molly Flynn, this type of theater, and I'm quoting, facilitates a collective process of recognition of both personal and cultural trauma. And just to wrap up, I'd like to say a couple of words about the use of graphic descriptions of bodies in pain. Monika talked about, you know, memories living in our bodies. I think it's quite important to hear how the bodies that were hurt by war are depicted in these pieces. So product contains explicit references and footage of soldiers who have been wounded. There's an actor, you can see it in a black and white image on the screen now. There's an actor that's lying on the stage throughout the entire show, representing a wounded soldier about which Sardayan talks. In Bad Roads, there's a whole scene where, apart from the two characters, there's a corpse at the back of the car, and this is the large image you can see here on the screen. It's a plastic bag that's shaped as a body. And in All That Remains, we have a scene where I encounter my brother's body in the morgue for the first time. An actor reads out the protocol of a military medical commission that describes the cause of my brother's death. And as I process this information, I also can view the wounds in front of me and have this encounter with the body, but also with my brother. So while both Bad Roads and the product chose to have a body on stage, so in product it's a live actor, and in Bad Roads it's this bag that's shaped as a body, I chose to focus on the absence. So we just had the uniform that eventually got rolled out and sort of represented the wounded body that way, but it served the same purpose. And these graphic scenes serve as a provocation for the viewers to imagine joining the symbolic we as active witnesses of extreme violence. Those watching the shows are confronted with substitute, but nevertheless explicitly presented bodies that have been hurt by war. Bearing witness carries the responsibility of sharing suffering, right, albeit secondhand. And as Susan Sontag says, so far as we feel sympathy, we feel we are not accomplices to what caused the suffering. An audience can, of course, turn away or choose to witness the consequences of political violence recreated in front of them on stage. And again, as Sontag puts it, there is the satisfaction of being able to look at the image without flinching, but there's also the pleasure of flinching. Now, whether we flinch or not, we become a witness, and as such, we share in the trauma, even if it is for the duration of the show only. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Olesya, for this wonderful lecture. In our first conversation, we briefly spoke also about Susan Sontag. I was actually hoping someone would bring her up, and in the first conversation we had, it was beautiful to hear that you were already looking to her and her work, and we will talk more about this in the group discussion. For now, I would like to hand over the microphone to the wonderful artist Jessica Ostrowicz, who was born in Birmingham, UK in 1990. She went on to study at the Academy of Fine Art in Dresden, Germany, and afterwards at the Royal College of Art in London. Repetition and ritual as compulsive elevators and placating elevators of trauma are central to her work, and her artistic research focuses on the transgenerational effects of trauma on the development of rituals. Using a litany of fragile motifs and small gestures, assembled, cut, sewn, drawn, folded, cast, welded, recorded, collected, archived, and repeating them to a level of absurdity over long periods of time, the resulting works are purpose-built for mourning those ancestral ghosts which continue to impact us today. So I would like to welcome Jessica, and handing over to you, Jessica, now.
Thank you so much, Monika, and also Tom and everyone else that I'm getting to speak alongside today. It's an absolute honour, especially that we are able to address some of these really vital themes at the moment. So I'm going to share my screen now. I'm going to start by talking through some of the broader themes that feed into my work, in the hope that this will give some grounding context to the particular works of mine that I will go on to explain a little later. So starting with trauma retention. This is what happens when we don't deal with a trauma that we've experienced. It can exist as a scar, cut, or alteration in our DNA coding, which then gets passed from generation to generation. This is epigenetics and is a microbiological phenomenon rather than a psychological one. Or it can be passed down in a propensity to certain character traits. Trauma in a person can outwardly look like idiosyncrasies in a personality, be it an aggression, a coldness, a reservedness, or quietness. And the inheritance of this can be experienced in the next generation as a higher level of cortisol. Cortisol is our stress hormone, and it prompts us to a heightened level of alertness and consequently anxiety, a little bit like adrenaline. Actually, both of these things, the epigenetics and the cortisol increase, can be passed down up to 7 generations. So we could be feeling the echoed effects of something that happened about 150 years ago. Too much cortisol can lead to insomnia, problems with memory, and psychiatric issues like depression and anxiety. Branching out, trauma that is experienced as a family can outwardly look like a family trait, and on an even larger scale, trauma that is experienced by a country or race or a class or constituency of people can begin to outwardly look like a cultural thing. Moving now to trauma ghosting, that feeling that something bad is about to happen that follows a person throughout their life. It's that shadow that doesn't always make sense, but that causes responses in a person's body that aren't always proportionate to their circumstance, particularly when they are inherited responses rather than more direct responses to a lived experience. I like to imagine this a little like Zugenruhe, a nocturnal migratory restlessness that is felt in birds that have been bred in captivity, leading up to and during their natural migratory period. Birds held in captivity will orient themselves in their cages in the direction of the usual migratory flight path, and they'll start fluttering their wings as though in flight. This isn't a traumatic response, although I personally find it quite heartbreaking, but it's something that resonates with me as an image. This leads me to a more personal space. As a person of Eastern European Jewish heritage, I often use pieces of Jewish narratives and ritual as a framework for approaching this pretty nebulous topic of epigenetics and transgenerational traumas. My family is in England as a direct result of pogroms and of the Shoah. And within my family, we have a long history of mental illness, of depression, and of anxiety. And I've been experiencing it myself since I was 7. It was at that age that I began collecting and organising stones, which is something that's continued into my practice. And I was also drawing and writing as a way of closing myself off and keeping myself safe. I've also often battled with a feeling that I need to keep moving or leaving. And actually, I feel my safest when I'm unknown and in a new place. It's all quite strange because from the age of 7, I'd experienced no actual trauma and I was part of a very happy family. But I remember even from a much younger age, perhaps as young as 3, being prone to this really deep-seated sadness. And at that age, I thought of this sadness as Poland, whatever that word means to a 3-year-old that has got no understanding of abroad or countries, or even anywhere beyond their immediate world. As an artist, I find myself particularly fascinated by the perpetuation of traumatic memories that are kept alive in Judaism. Collective memory is transmitted and sustained through conscious efforts like ritual and recital. And the festival Pesach, Passover, is an example of extreme persecution of Jews. One of the lines recited in the festivities is, "In each and every generation, let each person regard themselves as though they had emerged from Egypt." Hanukkah is also a reminder of persecution and genocide. And while admittedly both of these festivals are celebrations of resilience and of overcoming, they also include reminders of greatest tragedy. At Pesach, we eat food that recollects tears and bitterness. At weddings, a time of great joy, a glass is smashed so we don't forget the destruction of the temple. At Sukkot, we invite Ostrowicz or guests, figures from the past, to join the table with us. And we also now have Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Memorial Day. One of the questions central to my work is, if trauma can be inherited, can healing also be inherited? It is this in particular that is why I find ritual as a practice particularly interesting, because I see it as a paradox within Judaism. On the one hand, ritual is a repetition that reinforces something like a faith or belief, an identity. And sometimes recurring an act can be a negative reinforcement, or in this instance, a reminder of a painful ancestral memory. But on the other hand, having a time set aside for ritual and for memory, a time which has a start point and an end point, means that the effects they bring up have a finishing point too. It's this setting aside of a time for active remembrance, which may then remove it from passive traumatic retention. Open time, nebulous open time, a lifetime, decontextualizes trauma, and I imagine it turns it into a much more difficult ghost to face or pin down or overcome. But a specific designated place and time, like a ritual can provide, can contextualize the trauma and then possibly begin to release it. It's a little bit like with Jung's shadow theory. A ghost is summoned, perhaps even welcomed, it's acknowledged, and then it is asked to leave. We so often talk these days about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, but I think many people are walking around with what I call pre-TSD, predetermined traumatic stress disorder. I can see it in myself as a direct link between the shooting of my great-grandfather at Katyn in a ditch that he would have had to have dug himself, to my grandfather's fleeing, lifelong feelings of guilt, suicide, sadness, and aggression, to my father's anxieties and propensity to keep moving, then to my own fears that everything will be somehow taken away. And every generation of my grandmother's family has battled with depression and anxiety, stretching as far back as we can trace to Lithuania, where so often is the case for Jewish families, the traceable line has been destroyed or lost. In my artwork, I look at ritual Sometimes I use it as a process for making, and often the finished works are catalysts for healing and offer a pretext for the hopeful rewiring of our stress reactors. In this piece called Cleave, I set in motion a period of mourning which can be run concurrently with my life. The idea is that the work can be a proxy for all of the mourning and the reparation that hasn't been historically done. And the hope is that if it starts now and doesn't stop, then perhaps at some point it will catch up with the present day and finish itself and become obsolete. There are many parts to this piece, but of particular relevance here are the humanoid heads I have made. Each one is based on the ancient technology found in water whistles. The sound is made by water being rocked from one chamber to the other, which forces air out through a small hole. Each of these heads has a different size hole, and these holes have been designed to produce a sound that is at the same pitch as a family member's voice. There are 7 in total, including myself as a 7-year-old child, my brother, my grandfather. The sound is a wailing. It's something that we don't often afford ourselves as human beings. Cleave as a word reflects so much to me. It is the only word in the English language whose 2 definitions are opposites of each other. Cleave means both to take apart and to put together. I believe that this is at the heart of mourning and also at the heart of healing. And you'll notice as I move on that a lot of my works are physically based around fragile constructions or mended reconstructions. If dismembering is to take apart, then remembering could be to put together. The next piece, Reconstitution, is a semi-reconstruction of the wall in my studio, which I have pulled apart in flakes of paint. Hidden underneath the white emulsion, there are layers and colours of the past lives of the studio space. Before it was a studio, we see the strata of time and events. These elusive colour variations and discolorations start to suggest an order, and perhaps the same kind of order that I seek for my own sense of stability. The domestic connotations of the household paint with the various colours, and also this attempt that I make at establishing order, suggest an anxiety to keep a home in one place. This is something particularly poignant when I think about Judaism as a dispersed diaspora people. Once something is disturbed or destroyed, it can never be quite the same again. And the result is an attempt at ordering chaos. It's a network of imagined connections between jarring fragments. Wailing Wall is made up of thousands of birds that I cut into baking paper and assembled into 2 lace-like curtains in an attempt to make beautiful the negative space. They are light enough to be buffered by movement in the room, and this movement makes scratching noises across the floor. The passage of time causes ruptures in the reprocessing of memories. And whilst identifiable as birds, if you stand back from Wailing Wall, if you stand up close, these become a body of lacerations and of cuts. And the piece appears fragile enough to be pulled apart by its own weight. I'm going to finish now by looking at 2 pieces: blinkers for protection against visual hypersensitivity and echolocation for protection against oral hypersensitivity. I created both of these pieces of works as props or hypothetical techniques to combat the fears I believe I have inherited and which can sometimes make day-to-day life feel a little overwhelming. Both of these pieces contain elements made from handfuls of collected stones, which I use as a reference to tzror, memorial stones placed at Jewish gravesites as markers of impenetrable grief, and also a promise of permanence in memory. In moments of hypersensitivity and anxiety, sight and sound can magnify themselves and present as a pressure on the body and a hindrance to steady cognition. The blinkers work to fit around the eyes and limit vision and light and hold the face a little bit like hands. Echolocation is based on the technique used by people within the blind community to work out distance and space by using sound. So I'm going to end here with part of echolocation for protection against oral hypersensitivity, which follows my blindfolded route off a street, through a building, up into my apartment, to my bedroom and into bed. It's a recording of a practice in sight through sound. Repetitions and rituals tune out the visual and oral world. And this technique for seeing allows me to reach a place of safety. Thank you. Thank you very much. I shall pass you on to the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for the beautiful and deep presentation. There's so much that came up there where I would love to ask so many questions, but I will keep it also for the group discussion. But something that I can see already that connects us all so far is like this fragmented situation, something that also Olesya was bringing up. And that's something that I would love to talk more about in our group discussion. Now I have a little breather for our brain. We are going to present now a video, so you can all kind of sit back and relax and lay down whatever you may want to do. And yeah, I made this video lecture that I'm going to present now together with my collaborator, Jackie Rydz, who's also present here. We've worked together on projects before. One thing that certainly connects us is like that we both have this hybrid identity. We grew up in Germany, both with the Polish heritage. And while we both have a very different approach to it, it's something that is a red thread throughout this video also. A short introduction to Jackie Rydz. They were born and raised in Hamburg, studied stage design at Berlin University of the Arts, and were active as a translator for the Polish-German abortion rights group Ciocia Basia. They currently study in the MA program of Applied Theatre Studies of Justus Liebig Universität and work as a performer, activist in queer education and social work with cognitively disabled adults in Hesse, Germany. Now I'm going to share my screen and present you the video and just some technical some quick time. Language forms our identity muscles, an invisible structure that crawls through our mind and body. My sharp cheekbones and long nose are an evidence for the Polish vowel system that consists of 6 oral monophthongs and 2 nasal diphthongs.
W, on, L, sh, sh.
My German brain landscape looks at the Polish words as if they were written in a rush, as if some letters were removed in the moments when the Polish map was removed by foreign hands. the state of being moved around and round and round and never arriving. I never felt that I belonged anywhere. My father passed away in my early childhood, and with him an integral part of my future and past identity. Suddenly, the house that he built for us was only filled with German words. My mother's fear of the integration system squeezed me into a German costume that did not suit my style. As the first non-German villager in the village where I grew up, my father faced the suspicious gazes of those people who had never left the village. As Isolde Charimi explains, our pluralistic society mostly scares those who define their identity over their nationality. The unknown challenges their singular concept of truth. Polacke. That's how some Germans call Polish people, an ethnophilism or derogatory ethnic label. Discrimination is the act of making unjustified distinctions between human beings based on the groups, classes, or other categories to which they are perceived to belong.
Sigrid Weigel proposes understanding generation as a symbolic form that is, as a cultural pattern for constructing history. From this perspective, the study of generation also includes the implicit significance of gender relations for the construction of history and cultural memory.
Rodzice i dziadkowie byli przegonieni z Ukrainy w 1945 roku. W 1946 właściwie oni przyjechali już. No bo to była Polska i granice były inaczej. No i to już po wojnie Ukraina jako land należała do Polski. Po wojnie granice zostały inaczej podzielone i po prostu to była Rosja, czy tam jak to spało, radziecki. Takie to była zbieranina z całej Polski, Ukrainy i było jeszcze parę rodzin, 8 czy 10 rodzin niemieckich i to było bardzo niespokojne. I jako dziecko to pamiętam, że po prostu to był taki ten niepokój.
When I visited my grandfather, the last time before his death, he shared with me how he fled to Poland with his family. My grandfather peeled big apples from the Polish market with his craftsmaker's hands that had sewn many, many dresses throughout his life.
Kiedy byłem małym chłopcem, mieszkałem w Białorusi. Sowieckie żołnierze weszli do mojej szkoły i nas pobili. Stukli moje kolano na części pierwsze. Potem uciekliśmy z rodziną do Polski i w pewien dzień poznałam twoją babcię Irenę, która przyszła do Polski z Ukrainy.
Two lovers melting together in another broken land. Ukraine and Poland's relationship was difficult. Enemies turning into friends, who could potentially be friends with the enemies.
Dziadek po wojnie jakby ocalił właściwie też moją mamę, babcię, od gwałtu na dworców końskich przez żołnierzy ruskich, gdzie babcie zaczepiali, chcieli ją tam, wiesz.
In November 1981, my father visited Germany with his brother and cousin, a one-way ticket. Between December 1908 and July 1983, Polish People's Republic announced the martial law in Poland, stan wojenny w Polsce. Everyday life was drastically restricted in an attempt to counter political opposition, in particular the solidarity movement, Solidarność, that my father was part of, leading to the imprisonment of thousands of opposition activists and the killings of 1901.
If my father had returned to Poland, he would have walked straight into the prison, but instead he walked into the arms of my mother.
No przeżywałam bardzo, bo było strasznie, po prostu wtedy ludzie pozamykali, zakłady plajtowały. Upadła w ogóle ten rząd Jaruzelskiego, upadł wszystko. Ludzie zaczęli prywatyzować zakłady, sprzedawać zakłady pracy.
A part of migration is the choice of which stories you want to take with you, which stories the generation that follows listens to and remembers with you.
Mojego tatę chcieli zmusić do wstąpienia do partii, a tata nie chciał należeć do tej partii komunistów rosyjskich, ponieważ był patriotą, był partyzantem. No, był w obozie koncentracyjnym w Neugamme też. Był aresztowany i był tam też osadzony do wyzwolenia, ponieważ udało mu się uciec podczas nalotów aliantów na pociąg tych wszystkich więźniów. Mieli ich wywieźć na statek na Kabarkone. I ten statek miał być zatopiony z tymi więźniami. W czasie tego transportu był nalot aliantów na ten pociąg. Uciekł z kolegą, kimś uciekł w czasie tego nalotu z tego transportu i ukrywał się.
As the author Ocean Vuong said, after the anger, after the rage, you are exhausted. You are tired of screaming and you have to rest. Then you stand up to feed the cats, to answer emails. In short, you have to care. After generations of crying and rage, I want to be the one who is standing up to care. Ich habe mich entschieden, Folgendes zu erzählen oder nicht zu erzählen. Folgendes zu sein oder nicht zu sein. Zu zeigen, wer ich bin, wenn ich Sauerkraut esse. Oder wer ich bin, wenn ich Sałatka jarzynowa esse. Babcia Tereska und Babcia Marysia haben sich sehr gefreut, als ich gefragt habe, wer sie sind. Haben sich sehr gefreut. Sie wurden das noch nie gefragt. Kann nicht sagen, dass ich verstehe, was sie durchgemacht haben. Kann es nicht sagen, aber das kann ich liefern. Hiermit. Das kann ich liefern. Kunst machen im Kapitalismus als Final Destination. Final Destination eines Kampfes von Generationen, Leid, Gewalt und ich will nicht für sie weinen. Will nicht, weil sie alle haben genug geweint. Über alle Jahrzehnte haben genug geweint. Weinen, Wein. Trink den Wein der Tränen mit mir, mein Kind. Es ist deine Entscheidung. Du kannst entscheiden. Wir können entscheiden. Als Winzer brauen wir es jetzt selber an, das Blut, das sich in Wein verwandelt oder der Leib Christi in Brot. Die Symbolik der biblischen Generationen im Sonderangebot. Wer will es kaufen?
Fragmented archives, the potential questions that remain in our bodies, are sent into the void. Sometimes an echo returns, reminding us of the encrypted pieces that we inhabit, and become understandable only when we accept the plurality of the singular.
Thank you very much. Monika. I just want to say hi. Hello, I'm Jackie Rydz. Thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you so much. So welcome back everyone, and I also want to thank to Babcia, Tereska and Marysia. So this is so amazing because literally on my side of the Polish ancestors, I have not had any more person to ask, and that's something which is so beautiful about this collaboration, and also something that is so wonderful to see how your grandmothers were so happy about this question to be asked. And that's something that I would like to also talk about in our group discussion. How important it is to ask a question and continue hearing these stories. So that being said, I would like to hand over the imaginary microphone to our last speaker, Nina Mdivani. She's a Georgian-born and New York-based independent curator, writer, and researcher. Her academic background includes international relations and gender studies from Tbilisi. I always have difficulty pronouncing. Thank you. State University, Mount Holyoke College, and most recently museum studies from City University of New York. Nina's book, The King is Female, published in October 2018 in Berlin by Wieland Verlag, explores the lives of 3 Georgian women artists and is the first publication to investigate questions of the feminine identity in the context of the Eastern European historical, social, and cultural transformation of the last 20 years. Welcoming Nina, and thank you for being here.
Well, thank you, Monika, for the introduction. And let me share with you the screen to talk about Georgia and how it processes intergenerational trauma in its arts. And I'll give you 2 examples just on. Are you able to see this? The screen? Yes. Yes, so to start with, let me just, it's hard to talk about intergenerational trauma in Georgia outside of its historical context and geopolitical context. So I just put the map here because historically Georgia has always been in the intersection of interests of Orthodox Russia and Muslim Turkey or Iran or countries that had very different religious kind of orientation. And this is why historically Georgia always felt affiliated more with the Russian culture, with the Russian kind of, religion. And unfortunately, as we all know, Russia is an aggressive country with its kind of agenda, global agenda, and this continues. And I can definitely relate to Olesya's story how this is an ongoing process, unfortunately. And for Georgia, it started in with the Treaty of Georgievsk in 1783 that was ratified by Regla II of Georgia. It brought the significant parts of Georgia under protection of Russia, which gradually led to the annexation of the country. And this is something that started in 1783 and continues to this day in one form or the other. So there was a little kind of a break in when the Bolshevik Revolution happened in 1917 that led to a brief period of Georgian independence. And this was a very unique time in Georgian history because a lot of thinkers from Europe, also fleeing Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, fled to Georgia. And they created a very unique and very brief, unfortunately, ecosystem, not dissimilar to the Weimar Republic, because a lot of cultural things were happening. Futurist Manifesto was written, Brothers Danevich came here. A lot of artists created a very intense cultural climate. But it all ended in 3 years with the invasion of the Red Army and the annexation of Georgia in February 25 of 1921. And Georgia became Soviet Republic for the next 70 years. before the collapse of 1991, it was the Soviet Republic, as we all know. So now I would like to kind of talk more about how it was, how these events are reflected in how this, this ongoing tragic events, I would say, this fluctuation of various types of aggressive behavior from Russia to Georgia, how it is reflected in the Georgian culture and the arts. And for that, I looked at the outstanding book of Alexander Etkin, who is a cultural historian, who outlined two narratives of terror. So one consisting of stories of losses, mass murders, and solitary deaths, and the second consisting of memory and grief, shared experience, and collective mourning. So intergenerational trauma belongs, of course, to the second narrative. According to Atkins, the two narratives take up about 50 years of historical processing, or roughly 2 generations. First affected generation works with the factual tragic events and their implications. Second and subsequent generations work through the memories and traumas, processing them mimetically through literature and arts. And now I would like to talk about two examples of how Georgian visual arts have been processing traumas of the past. Initially, I thought of including a third one, but I thought it will be just too much for this brief presentation. So the first example that I would like to talk about is a film by the Georgian director Tengiz Abuladze called Repentance, or in Georgian it's called Mula Nieba. It was filmed in 1987. So it was banned from the release in the Soviet Union as its main anti-hero combined visual features and personalities of Stalin, head of the KGB Lavrenti Beria, as well as of Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini. And by combining these features of these dictators of the 20th century, Abuladze was making a larger statement that was not only about local evil, but it was about the universal evil of the 20th century. And in that way, of course, it was very groundbreaking thing that he did in 1987 when the Soviet Union was still there. The film received glowing reviews and grand prize of the jury in 1987 Cannes Film Festival, and was also nominated for the Academy Award. But it was selected, but it was never nominated. It's an interesting point. So why did this? So just in Georgia, it is considered, and also, I think I would say it was pretty influential film in Russia as well, and it was called, if you read analytical analysis of this time, of this cultural life at that period, it is said that this film kind of started perestroika in a way, because it started to open up this conversation about the Stalin terror, about the victims of the regime. So why I wanted to talk a little bit more about this. So why was this film so significant at this point? So it was the first time that on a large screen was told the story of a repressed family of an artist, Sandro Baratelli, who suffers from a regime, by telling the truth and is killed for this on an absurd charge that he, among other 2,600 people, was plotting to build an underground tunnel from Bombay to London. And by kind of putting this very fictional detail of this absurd charge, Abuladze, the director, makes us think about all the absurd charges on which the whole families and the whole generation was pretty much wiped out during the Soviet time. And then, so the main story of the film is that after 30 years, his daughter Ketevan punishes the tyrant who passes away by repeatedly digging up his corpse and bringing it to his house, because according to her, people like him can't rest after what they have done. So in this way, this very strong metaphor that, even when the regime or the tyrants pass away, their memory is still there, and the memory and their legacy is still there. And this is kind of still from this film, how this corpse is brought to this family's house, and how ultimately his son and his grandson are punished for his sins. So it was the first time that the Soviet society to encounter sins of their fathers and grandfathers, because this was not something that was discussed at all at that time in 1987, right? And the first time to talk about this, as well as so this was a call kind of to repent, to talk about it, to start a dialogue. And according to Abulad's interview for New York Times that he gave in also when the film was released, the stories of the film's victims are drawn from the history of well-known Georgian cultural and political figures who were arrested and shot in 1937. So allegedly, the dialogue about the past has started with the film in Georgia, but was not really continued. Soviet past continues to traumatize the country, always ambivalent about this position. I can talk a little bit towards the end why I think this is the case. So these are also two stills from this film. And so the way the film is structured, so ultimately it is the youngest generation, the grandson of this tyrant is actually repenting for the sins by saying that the past should not be forgotten, and that we have to acknowledge the sins and repent for them. And he does it with his own life. So the second project that I would like to talk to you about in this context is this the curatorial project that I presented in 2020, in March 2020 in Kunstraum in Brooklyn. It was called New York Meets Tbilisi Defining Otherness, Part 2, and specifically the project of Georgi Rodionov, My Parents Don't Talk to Me. And the reason why I actually presented this photographs as part of this exhibition is precisely because the Soviet past continues to haunt Georgia and Georgians, although they try not to kind of acknowledge it. And they're always, so this is always otherness that's still there, but it's still affecting people and generations, but it's not talked about. And so I thought that Georgi Rodionov's project specifically was actually ideal way of discussing it. And so the Rodionov found these photographs, about 600 black and white photographs in his family house. So they were dating from 1950s from 1980. He created an artistic book, and also, and I had these photographs here that I could present in New York. So as he was saying, he was able to recognize many places and people in them. However, he was surprised that he knew nothing about the stories behind the photographs. Nobody had ever shared them with him. And as he was saying, I started to think more deeply about why my parents don't share any of their memories from this time. And then I realized that it wasn't just my parents, it's an entire generation of Georgians who choose to be silent about their past. And unfortunately, this trend continues. And you can see here a few photographs from this project. And I think they were interesting because they present a very different snapshots of different time. But at the same time, when we don't discuss, as all the presenters actually mentioned, when this is not discussed, it kind of affects us in a very negative way. And instead, just a few preliminary conclusions on my end as a curator and as a writer who decided to live outside of Georgia, because for me, it's a little disorienting when I go there. It's my country, but at the same time, it's still very heavily influenced by the aggressive neighbor that we always will have there, and there is really not any very concrete way of escaping that influence, unfortunately, because of our geopolitical location, I guess. So instead of talking openly and reevaluating, Georgians prefer to ignore the past, not talking about it, passively denying its importance and need for reevaluation, but the past continues to seep through the cracks. So accepting trauma comes from acknowledging the guilt, talking about right and wrong sides. And if this started to happen in the 1990s, when there was a civil war, actually also in a way initiated by the Russian side, it didn't continue because essentially the same political powers are in place, even now, dividing a country between the tacit supporters of the past and its rejectors. So there are some new, very exciting initiatives on this end. And when I was researching for this presentation, I found out a couple of new initiatives, and I really hope that it will continue and it will open up more dialogues. One of them is Museum of Repressed Poets that accumulates oral histories. And this gives me a marginal hope that this could be discussed even more, and more kind of personal stories will emerge, and the younger generation will have a better understanding. Because what happens right now, and I can say it from the experience of, for example, of my niece who is 25 years and who never doesn't have a very good understanding of the Soviet past at all. And she's a journalist and she's a photographer, but for them, for this generation, it is a past of long ago, but at the same time, they don't have a very good grasp of understanding how it still affects us, how this ambivalence of the past is actually still there. But I hope that with kind of reemergence of this stories from these repressed poets, repressed writers, artists, that we are able to kind of to incorporate this past and arrive at a more kind of inclusive and more, rounded understanding of the present and hence the future. So I think I will stop here. And I mean, as all older countries, as the countries with old history, and this is the case for Eastern European countries, there are always many things to highlight, unfortunately, in this ambivalence. But let's just hope that art will help us, and artistic projects will actually kind of lead the way for this.
Thank you so much, Nina. I like your final sentence, and I strongly believe in it. So we are kind of heading over to the group discussion now, and I hope everyone is still hydrated in Berlin. I think it's 40 degrees now, but I'm drinking loads of water. So I feel so on one hand, I'm going to start now with a question, and also us as speakers, we are going to be able to ask questions. But I would also encourage everyone in the audience to kind of share questions. On one hand, you can share them in the chat box if you would rather have me reading them. On the other hand, also, you are able to unmute yourself. I would ask you to maybe, I think there's the possibility to raise the hand here, or there's the possibility to raise the hand. So I'm going to unmute you when you have such a question. And I'm going to start with a question that kind of, I feel, when listening to all of us, has come up various times, this fragmented states, which I find interesting because I feel we are all kind of working in an interdisciplinary way, even if we may not all call ourselves like this, but I think it's something which is interesting. And I'm kind of curious for myself also when I'm thinking about this, whether this fragmentedness has led me into this interdisciplinary kind of path, because in a way I feel, for example, Olesya, you are actually a historian and also a theater maker. And I'm first asking you, Olesya, but I'm welcoming everyone to answer this also, whether this kind of fragmented state, whether being kind of left with these traces of history that were partially not giving all the answers, was leading you to actually also using theater and other art forms to kind of fill some of the gaps.
Thank you so much for that question, Monika. It's a kind of dream question, and I'm going to really struggle to answer it briefly, but I'll try. Historians, at least traditionally, have the temptation to explain it in a kind of, reach out to some kind of truth and use the archival evidence to guide us there, right? To somehow tell us how it actually happened. I mean, I think more and more within the profession, we've relaxed our expectations a little bit. We don't expect to produce the ultimate truth. We are aware of the body of primary evidence as being ultimately incomplete and problematic, and such there has to be questions, and the creation of the archive itself has to be questioned, and we need to see the narrative behind the creation of the archive, how we collect evidence, how we store it, and what sort of story that tells. So that in itself helped me to maybe reach out to different disciplines. I always find it much easier to, it is just a kind of natural process. I didn't sit down and think, oh, interdisciplinarity is what, is required of funding applications. No, not at all. It was a kind of the tool that was absolutely necessary. I mean, I work with gender a lot, and women's stories are simply missing in much of the war history, right? And so I need some kind of frameworks to bring those voices into, define them. And it's amazing that most of us here, are talking about a lot about women's histories, to find them. And so I reach out to security studies, I reach out to international relations, to sociology, to something else, and it just comes naturally. As for theatre, I mean, I was in theatre before I was in academia. I grew up in the theatre, so that was something that I had, the tool that I already had, and I felt like teaching is a performative role as well. It's you do a performance while you teach students. I mean, it's the kind of thing that you have to do. But what you don't do necessarily, you don't necessarily put yourself into it, right? You don't talk of your own experiences. What this kind of documentary theatre that my company does enabled me to do is very much put the company, because it's not just my story, the previous shows were about other people who were part of the company as well, to put our stories right there, to make ourselves as vulnerable as we possibly can in front of an audience, and to work through those experiences together, to turn experiences into text, into theatrical product, to perform them, then receive feedback, and it changes your experience. It makes you see it differently. And I think that's probably true about production of art. I don't know if you guys will agree, but it's definitely true of writing. So when I write something like that, when I write nonfiction, it takes me on a journey, and then I can see my experience differently. I know I've not answered that question, but I tried.
Thank you so much. That was really wonderful. It also reminded me of something interesting, because before, like some 2 or 3 months ago, I spoke to a Polish historian who lives in Germany now, and she actually was saying that a lot of female perspectives are actually erased. I just remembered it, and just to let everyone know, it was actually not an intention that that our kind of symposium and our seminar is only female-led, but it happened like this, which in a way I feel also reminds me that in a way our practices of like going deeper into history is something kind of that comes from this intuition, something that I feel is interesting. So in a way, I think, for example, Jackie, I find it interesting to think about your grandmothers. Like when you asked them, you were saying something beautiful in this video also, where you said they were finally being heard. They were finally feeling like someone was listening. And that was really touching for me. I mean, on one hand, as a collaborator, but generally it was making me aware, wow, this is strange. Like, how can it be that they are not listened to? Because they're like, I said to my mother, they're like, this archival material is like gold. It's like kind of gold because it's kind of vanishing away, sadly. And I'm curious, Jackie, also to hear from you how this process went for you, how you felt when you interviewed them, whether you also felt you recognized more parts about yourselves. I like to call this like this intergenerational symptoms. In a way, I'm curious to hear about this.
Yeah, thank you. I actually, yes, when we were talking, and I mean, we have a close relationship because they took care of me a lot. And so it was not weird that I, asked personal questions. And I mean, it was always the stories, for example, about my great-grandfather being in a cassette that was always present for me since I was a child. So it was no big news for me, but I wanted it recorded, I wanted it saved. And I was also thinking about this narrative about history, that's always about heroes, or it's mainly about cis male heroes who do things and who make things happen, etc. And it's so much also about this caring work that my grandmothers provided very often, and that led on through generations, and many things that they talked about, and many also this perspective about what where they went. And I mean, for example, my one grandmother, she always went to places with the family because of the job of her husband, my grandfather. But I'm the one, but I'm talking to her, and she's the one who's telling me, and she's the one who has a relationship to all of her children and grandchildren. So I think that's very interesting that this kind of also history making or being also acknowledged as such is something that is by my female relatives only, almost.
Mm. If anyone has some more comments to say, otherwise I'm going to guide through. I find it interesting because in a way I feel in these recent years in the art context, the subject of care came up more. And that's kind of something that I find interesting as well in this context. And Marta is going to hold this like a small meditation after our group discussion. And Marta, I would be curious to kind of hear from you also, because Rydz Zenith Collective is like this, a Polish collective of two curators, Marta and Zula. And I'm curious kind of to hear also how, how in such times as now, specifically when we speak about this ongoing issues of like trauma, as in, for example, Ukraine, Belarus, Georgia, as Nina and Olesya, you were saying, how maybe it's also a question for all of us, how we are having to kind of find new forms of solidarity, new forms of healing in that sense. So whoever wants to kind of contribute to that question. Wait, I think you're still muted.
Hi. Thank you for this question. I actually wanted to also mention that myself and Zula, we really strongly believe in this kind of, collective learning and collaboration in general between artists and creatives. And we are predominantly a platform for female creatives, but we also want to include non-binary artists because we felt that was also missing, and especially in the countries like Poland where they are oppressed, it's very important to kind of give them a platform to talk about their projects, their thoughts, and so on. So that was one of the reasons why we decided to create this platform.
Thank you so much, Marta. I'm just reading for the question from Mayhill Fowler. Thank you so much for this. And I feel, so I had something in a similar range I was wanting to ask Jessica also, because Jessica actually, I loved in your presentation that it reminded me sometimes of Eva Hesse's way of using repetition. I'm sure some of you are familiar with her sculptures. Eva Hesse was also a survivor of the Holocaust and a very beautiful artist who was using kind of sculptures and repetition a lot. And I find it interesting kind of how repetition can be used as a method for healing, but at the same time, it's a symptom. So I'm curious to hear more about this from you, Jessica, and I'm also going to read Mehil's question. So what is the difference between processing trauma as an artist and creating art that helps an audience process trauma? And then how does art as a way of processing trauma change with different audiences in different places? So everyone is welcome to answer, but I'm curious also from Jessica to learn from you what your perspective is.
That's a massive question, a great question. And it's one that that I think is central to my whole art practice. So it's me working through that with every piece that I make. It's I don't want my work to be therapy for myself. I don't want it just to be a self-help. I want it to be slightly detached from myself in order to have more of a conversation with the audience. But I use my own framework, everything that I've experienced and all of the research that I do, I use that as an inroad to that topic. So repetition for me and sort of the development of ritual is more what I've put in place as a way of making things. So that's for myself. And I think it comes across in the work that it has got that slightly obsessive, almost unhealthily obsessive element to it. It takes a huge amount of time to make my work, and a lot of it is very, very small and detailed. And I think, well, I hope that that comes across in the viewer, that they can see that tension between something that is ritually sustained and also something that is bordering on a more manic level or a more traumatic level. I think a lot of people who do have to repeat things are often people who are mentally traumatized in some way. So yeah, I don't know if I'm answering the question particularly, but I am constantly straddling that line between whether the repetition is a positive one or whether it's more of a negative reinforcement. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
I could briefly say something to the second part of the question, and Mihal, I'd love to hear what you think as well. I mean, Mihal works in Ukrainian theatre and is a former actor herself. It would be great to hear some of your thoughts too, just on how does art change depending on the changing audience as well. I mean, for me, it was important with those specific plays that I talked about is that they've all been performed in the West and to some degree written for Western audiences too. I mean, that's true about Bad Roads. It was commissioned by the Royal Court, and obviously true about my show as well. I mean, I was specifically writing it for audiences here, and I think that was some of the decisions were conscious, and we were not, I don't think that Wróżby and certainly I were not trying to explain everything because it's impossible to explain, but we had those audiences in mind. And when the decision, and I wonder if Bad Roads was received differently in Ukraine, I suspect yes, and I'm sure that Alex's piece was received differently in Ukraine to how it was received in London or elsewhere in Europe. But when, as a company, we were thinking about taking our show to Ukraine, we had a lot of discussions, and the original idea was, no, we're not going to take it to Ukraine because nobody in Ukraine wants to hear a story of someone who witnessed the war from 2,000 miles away. They are so much closer to the front line. It's not a story to be told there. Then we changed our mind and we decided to actually take it to Ukraine and be honest about it and say, this is the story from someone, who's really far away from the front line and yet still was affected by the war in such a profound way. But sadly, the pandemic prevented us from taking it, so I can't compare. But I think obviously the processing and the talking through the trauma, bearing the audience in mind very much as participants and witnesses of that talking through is extremely important.
Yes, and I would like to also add to Olesya's point here. I think it's very interesting when you think about how the trauma is processed, to think about the narrators and the actors and how it changes based on the actual society, how open it is to understand that actors create their own narrative and the people in power create their own narrative. So when it changes a lot of nuances. And I think it's very important when we talk about trauma, when we talk about Eastern Europe, because of its old history, it's so many nuances there. And it's very context-based also, very geopolitically based on the context. Just wanted to add.
Yeah, I found it's actually interesting, Nina, because I wanted to also ask you a question, but you already kind of went into this. Because it's interesting because you said you left Georgia kind of as also, and you found the kind of advantage of this because it was kind of taking off this complexity of not being able to talk because people are silencing and kind of oppressing the trauma. And I find that super interesting, and especially because I think with Jackie and me, it's different because we grew up in Germany, so we're in this weird hybrid state that we can't escape somehow. But I think generally, I feel when I lived in London, it helped me a lot to get a new perspective on it, and was liberating me in a way to be able to talk about things. Even in the English language, I find it sometimes easier to talk about these experiences than in the German language. And I'm curious to also hear from you before we go on to Monika's question, what you have to say about that.
Sure, I think it's liberating in a way because it definitely gives you a perspective, but at the same, it creates distance, and looking at the things through a distance, through temporal distance as well as mental distance, it's a very big advantage. But at the same time, it could be double-edged sword. But when you go there, they tell you, you're not part of this anymore. You don't see some nuances again. So I think it's about all of us who decided to kind of live in the West. But at the same time, I just feel like for me coming here and, getting my education and, looking at helping me create a new kind of viewpoint is very important as a curator. But now I can also, and it's also important for me to be able to tell the story of Georgia in the West, which doesn't happen too often for smaller countries like this. But thank you for the question. Always it's something that's ongoing and unfolding in my life. So it's very important.
I think it also goes in this idea of how are we able to heal something that is ongoing, which Olesya and you both, Nina, were speaking about, which is a huge subject for probably at least one other seminar series. So Monika would like to ask a question, and I would invite you warmly to do so.
Thank you very much. Nice to come across another Monika, albeit it's not different. Good. Marta and I, we have crossed paths, and Marta, I'm delighted to have been listening to this really interesting session. I wonder, it's not so much a question, I hope you'll just give me a chance perhaps to make a few observations. I'm an art historian based in London of parents, the child of parents who came as refugees to this country. And for a long time I've been, I think, obsessed might indeed be the correct word, certainly preoccupied with the relationship of the visual arts to Jewish identity, to migration, displacement, trauma, and in particular, the Holocaust. And I was recently involved with a conference, which I think would be of great interest to everybody who's listening in today, organized by the University of Leicester, which was looking at what in my field, and I think this is probably a term that's familiar to many of you, this notion of the second generation, and then indeed the third generation, in other words, the children and then the grandchildren of those who experience profound trauma. And it's normally used in relation to the Holocaust, but it seems to me that it should and can be here broadened out to embrace other experiences and contexts. But I was so struck by the overlapping preoccupations that all such artists share, and I can just very quickly run through this idea of grasping at fragments, yes, clutching at traces, often in the form of old photographs, not always, of course, the power of the eloquence of silence, yes, that sort of need to break past it, break through it. Gender, I mean, again, it's very interesting what you were saying in this conference, and it was on the 7th of May, and incidentally, if you're interested, Marta, I can send you the recording, which has recently become available. Again, not planned at all, but I would say 90% of the speakers were female, and I think it's not accidental and really interesting. I was also very intrigued, Susan Sontag came up. Of course, as you know, her writing is very much, I think, sparked by an awareness of the Holocaust and how you grapple with those terrible photographs. Marion Hirsch, the notion of post-memory, which nobody's actually mentioned, but of course it's absolutely at the heart of everything you've been talking about. Helen Epstein, as you may know, was also one of the first American Jewish to talk about the children of the Holocaust survivors' experiences, and used a term which I think is, again, absolutely pertinent to everything that's been said today, possessed by history we never lived. I think, that in a sense sums it up as well. And perhaps just by way of conclusion, but I'd love to continue the conversation perhaps on some other occasion, another writer who you haven't mentioned, who's not so much trauma is part of what he's talking about, but it's very much about the kind of the fact that being displaced profoundly can be both a blessing and a curse. Yes, a blessing perhaps in terms of creative responses is Willem Flusser. Yeah, anyway, so I'll stop there, but thank you very much. It's been truly fascinating.
Yeah, thank you so much, Monika. I love that you were giving us a summary of the lecture, which was clearing my mind a little bit, so quite beautiful. And I'm glad that, hearing you, I'm glad that everything was kind of, arriving in such a beautiful mind also. And Willem Flusser, and there are so many other people whom I would love to mention. As I said before, I would love to make this a seminar series, so if anyone wants to collaborate on this, just let me know. That being said, I would say we have space for one more question before we head over to Marta's meditation. So if anyone has a burning question, maybe also two, but yeah.
Can I just ask, Monika?
Yes.
Just for any of the panel, whether they feel that there's that this subject is of growing interest, or how it is perceived. I think, thinking from a Counterpoints Arts point of view, it's sort of, these subjects are always implicit in a huge amount of the work of a lot of artists that we work with, but necessarily engage with explicitly as often as it might be. And I wondered if the panel would reflect, is this a subject that's of growing interest? Is it changing? Is it a difficult subject to bring up? Just, yeah, any reflect.
Yet also, I had written down in my notebook the question that came up specifically when we talked about Susan Sontag, whether some of you consider your practice as political, which is kind of making it difficult in a sense. So I'm curious. I mean, I could talk about this, but if anyone else wants to go first, Jessica.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about it, at least from my perspective. I think it is getting increasingly popular as a topic, especially trauma. I'm not so sure about intergenerational trauma, but you hear about it a lot, especially within Black diasporas, wanting to talk about intergenerational trauma. But from my perspective, given that I use quite a few Jewish tropes in my work, I feel like people working now are in quite a privileged position because we do have that distance where we can properly reflect back on things without it being too traumatic. So like, I think I mentioned in my talk that my grandparents' generation went through the Holocaust, and it was very much a part of their lives that they weren't able to speak about. And then their children, so like my father, for example, were also unable to talk about it or to move past it because it was the atmosphere that they were raised in. And so I've now, as the second generation, and when the third generation comes along, I've got a really unique position where I can still talk to the people that went through that without feeling like I'm overly traumatized. And I think that is a completely unique situation in history because the next generation won't have that point. They won't have the living reference point anymore.
Yeah, I agree. How I mentioned in my lecture, I feel that somehow this form of alienation, I'm kind of using it for my artworks, which is kind of something as a privilege. It's not that I'm like Ludwig Wittgenstein, who wrote his books in the First World War, which is kind of something that I highly admire, but also kind of am amazed how a person within the situation can write about everything so clearly. And in a way, I feel it's almost for me, I perceive it as a treasure to have an archive that I can work with and that I can process in a way liberally, and also something that is getting more attention and getting more popularity. And at the same time, I feel, going back to Susan Sontag, it's a beautiful thing to do this in order to kind of change the ways how maybe the future will happen, in a way to maybe make people aware about the things that have happened in order to prevent more terror in some ways. That being said, I would love to pass on to Marta, who's from the Zenith collective, as I said previously, which she founded together with Zula. Something that you should also all take an eye on. And Marta is going to do a healing score workshop with us based on a painting. And I'm going to share the screen now to show the painting. And I would ask every one of you can switch off cameras, just relax, lay down, drink a lot of water, and enjoy.